Let's give her another round of applause. Thanks so much, Marlene, for making that epic journey from Winnipeg to Saskatoon, and for the insights you shared with us. Next on the agenda is Al Mussell. Al is the research lead and founder of Agri-Food Economic Systems. His areas of research expertise are farm management, agricultural marketing, and agricultural policy. For 15 years, Al served as senior research associate at the George Morris Center. Prior to that, he worked as an economist in the milk procurement division of Land O'Lakes in Minnesota. He is a past president of the Canadian Agricultural Economics Society, a past director of the Progressive Dairy Operators, and an alumnus of the U.S. State Department International Visitor Leadership Program. So please join me in welcoming Al.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much to the group for the invitation. What I was going to speak to this morning is really two topics. It's probably not evident from what we have in the program. I want to speak briefly about an ongoing study we have dealing with deferred delivery grain contracts funded by APAS and some of the provincial grain groups. And then I want to get into tariffs, and I think a lot of people are going to talk about tariffs today, but it's extremely important. So hope you get a range of views on this topic, including mine. We have an ongoing study, not yet complete, funded by APAS, a range of provincial groups. What that endeavors to do is to understand the experience that people have, producers, also the grain companies, with regard to deferred delivery contracts. We want to be able to work through this and characterize the essential elements of forward, what I would call forward contracts. And ultimately draw on experience, what people's needs, concerns they have, et cetera, in developing, sort of a template for a modernized grain contract that everybody can use. So my understanding is that right now there is a survey that we've designed that is in the field with Citrix, which is a third-party data collection company. So I invite all of you, if you're interested, and you can get the coordinates for this through APAS, to get to this survey. We're doing some other work ongoing, and we expect that we're going to have the findings by late spring, is the expectation. Look. This is difficult, but it's also not rocket science, okay? We're talking about contracts that are not production contracts. These are grain marketing contracts. They have to do with delivery and pricing, essentially. So, you need a contract that talks about who the parties are that are involved, what the price is going to be, what's going to be delivered in terms of quality, when it's going to be delivered, all those sorts of things. And then very importantly, how, life happens, there's variability in agriculture, we all know that, how the variances to the contract, what was envisioned in the contract, how those are handled and who is responsible. So, and boy, you look over some of the contracts that we've had access to, and frankly, not all these conditions are well established. So we need to find a way to bring all this to bear. In some cases, I think that some of the terms lack balance in how they're prescribed, and probably end up putting implicitly a lot of risk back on the farmer. And I think the most important thing to take away from this is that having deferred delivery contracts that work well is in everybody's interest. And And I should acknowledge before I go any further, Marlene, the previous speaker here, has an excellent study that blazed, drawing from her experience and expertise in kind of blazing the trail for this work. But one of the things you come away with is, look, it is not in anyone's interest, grain companies, producers, intermediaries, to have this not work well. Particularly on the grain company side, they like to be able to do back-to-back sales. And if this doesn't work, they can't do their back-to-back sales the same way. So I think this benefits everyone. Now, of course, one of the challenges we have right now, and I'm going to get into tariffs here in a moment, we need to be able to talk to the grain companies. And, look, some of them are probably beside themselves trying to figure out how they're going to navigate this crazy tariff environment. So we want to get to them, and we want to get to the right people. Right now, this topic is probably not their top priority. So we've been sort of hoping that we could get an opening here as under the idea that things will sort of settle down a little bit. But let me, one of the concerns I think I would have if I were a producer that had grain to sell is how on earth, if there's tariffs, how on earth is this going to work into forward contracts with U.S. customers? I'm going to come back to this in a couple minutes. Formally, the importer of record always pays the tariff. But there's nothing to stop them from saying, if the tariff ends up being $25 a ton, they could just come back and say, okay, well, I'm not paying it, it's just coming out of the basis. Boom, you're paying it. So how is that going to be handled? And at this point, I don't have a lot of good answers. And I think, the first thing, as a producer, you've got customers. You need to work with your customers, and talk to them. Sit down. How are we going to sort this out? How can we share things? That type of thing. But there's no escaping the fact that I think a lot of this is going to boil down to legal issues, and I underline that because I'm not a lawyer. So if you're in this position, don't count on my advice. You may need to talk to a lawyer. I suspect that some of the issues that are going to come up is if you're in this position with a forward contract, when was it initiated? So if you're presented with a contract tomorrow and it has no language in it that deals with tariffs, well, look, you should have known better if you sign that and then trouble happens. Now, conversely, if you're in a 5-year supply agreement with somebody in the U.S., well, 5 years ago, this wasn't even on the radar. So these are two very different issues, and I would imagine in a legal dispute, that's the consideration that will come up. Are there provisions that explicitly deal with matters of changes in taxation or tariff? What about a lot of people will fall back on. They'll say, well, wait a minute. We have this act of God, the so-called force majeure provision in contracts. Doesn't that cover this? Again, I'm not a lawyer, but my read of what the lawyers say is probably not. Like force majeure in Canadian courts, the standard's pretty high. It's literally like, there was a 500-year flood that knocked all the bridges out, and I literally couldn't deliver. Getting a much lower price than I thought I was going to get probably doesn't qualify. You were supposed to deliver on that or find some way to make it. Now, there is another language that lawyers use to talk about contracts being frustrated. That's a different issue. And the idea there is that both parties were wanting to make this work, but they, just for reasons outside of their control, they couldn't make it work. The other thing, when you get in the situation that we're in now, be very careful. Like if I were in this province, I would want the contract to be under this province's legal framework, or at least a Canadian framework. If you have something that is written under U.S. law, well, if it goes sideways, kind of good luck to you. So with that, I'm going to change gears here a little bit and get into tariffs here a little bit. And it's a little bit like where do you even begin? Because in a matter of weeks, you need to understand here, we're in an inflection point in history. There's no precedent for it. The idea that this is sort of a temporary disruption and in 4 years' time or whenever it will go back to normal, I don't think that is a correct assumption. So here we are. So how do you try and begin to think through this? Well, the first, what is attempting to be accomplished here on the U.S. side? Well, initially I had four rationales that I understood, and I've recently had to add a fifth here. The first one that I think was what most people thought when we got into this discussion around tariffs is, look, it's bullying. Okay, that's really all it is. So the best example we have is the fentanyl and immigration concerns that President Trump had. It's really using trade policy to accomplish other kinds of foreign policy objectives. Well, there's that motive. The other one is the idea of reshoring, building back U.S. manufacturing by raising these tariffs and effectively making it expensive to serve the U.S. market from outside the U.S. That's an apparent objective. The other thing that I'll get into here in a moment, but President Trump has said this a number of times, we're going to raise these tariffs and we're going to collect all this money. And I think that fits into a system that we need to understand. The fourth one here, this is pretty troubling. There's this idea that from some in the conservative community in the U.S. that, well, you literally have to go back to the end of World War II. And at the end of World War II, the United States was an active participant in these so-called Bretton Woods institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the GATT, what became the World Trade Organization, ultimately the United Nations, et cetera. And there's this idea that they, if there was a winner in World War II, it was the United States. And they could have run all over everybody globally. They could have set the terms for everything, but instead they agreed they treat everybody equally and sort of play nice. And the idea is that, on behalf of this group, that was a mistake. And that what has resulted from that is that now the US dollar is the reserve currency, which is structurally overvalued. And if it's overvalued, then it makes it very difficult for them to have a manufacturing industry because it makes their exports uncompetitive. So what, and this is all tied together with other countries holding, foreign countries holding US Treasury bills, et cetera, and maps back to military spending. So the idea behind the tariffs is it's an instrument to try and structurally weaken the US dollar, restructure the global balance of payments, particularly around foreign holdings of treasury bills and so on, and to try and push military spending back on other countries, which probably needed to happen anyway. But this way of going about it, we don't much appreciate it. I guess I'd put it that way. Finally, at this point, I think we've seen enough now that and the president said it enough. He said that he's looking to use tariffs to ruin the Canadian economy and make it obvious to us that we should become the 51st state. The difficulty that we have is on any one day, I don't know which of these motivations is at work on the U.S. administration's mind, what their priority is. So, the president, we've seen this before, he could take one of these motivations and kind of drive it his own direction. And I'm sure, some of the people around him, despite the incompetence that they've demonstrated for themselves recently, I think they're left shaking their head because they don't understand what he's doing. But from our perspective, it doesn't matter. This is very damaging, it's very troubling, and it's deeply concerning. In order to understand tariffs, I think we have to put this combined in a portfolio of what the administration is attempting to accomplish. So the president has a plan for large-scale deportation of people who are not authorized to be in the U.S., to not only reconfirm existing income tax rates later this year, which were temporary, brought in 2017, but to further decrease income tax rates, cut the federal budget, and then, of course, the tariffs. I started, back in November, I started working on this, looking, how do you begin to think about how all these things fit together? And this is my cut at it. I'll try and explain this briefly. It's a little bit complicated. I would start. I don't know. I'm not sure if I can point with this thing. Does this? Yeah. Okay. I can. I would start over here, and you start with the deportations. It is estimated that there are 13 million people in the United States that are unauthorized to be there, and it's also estimated that 65% of them are in the workforce. Now, the U.S. is currently at 4% unemployment. For all intent and purpose, that's full employment, right? So there's no way you can kick all these people, which by the way, hasn't been happening yet. They've been slow on this, and I guess they fired the head of Homeland Security, and they're trying to find ways to get more people out and so on, but they're slow on this. But if it lives up to its billing, there's no way that cannot shrink the GDP. There is no way, because you've got people in the workforce, and the idea is it's all the criminals and rapists and whatever else. That's not who they're. I mean, they just go down to the construction site. They go to a hotel or restaurant. They'll find people that are there illegally, or the dairy farm, or the food processing plant, right? When you shrink the GDP, you shrink the income tax base with it. And quite apart from that, there's further deep cuts to income tax plans. So your income tax base to fund the federal budget will structurally shrink. Now, you've got government cost cutting that will to some degree offset that. But boy, it's becoming evident. I honestly hadn't realized it, but the U.S. operates in a deficit of $3 trillion a year. Like, that's an unfathomable amount of money, okay? We have this debate coming up with this debt ceiling, and there are some people who have, drawn a line in the sand and said, no way are we going to move on a debt ceiling. Well, I don't know how you continue to run a deficit of $3 trillion without, like anything else in finance, after it runs over a year, it becomes debt, right? So I'm not sure how that all works. But one of the things that tariffs, in theory, can do is they raise money for the Treasury, and they can offset some of the losses due to a reduced income tax base and complement this government cost cutting. Well, then over and above that, if the tariffs are successful in bringing industries and companies back to the United States, well, then that in turn should increase the GDP. So there's a lot of offsetting factors here. Now, the one thing that, there hasn't been much talk about this, but I started to notice about 2 weeks ago, the president started saying, I sure hope the Federal Reserve doesn't raise the interest rates. Well, that's a little bit offside. That's supposed to be an independent entity, right? But you look at this and you say, well, how on earth could this not be inflationary? Moreover, it looks to me like a big machine that's running at high speed that's going to fly apart at any minute. And if you could, you'd stand back, but we can't stand back, right? We're next door. So it's a study into itself, just trying to take apart the various pieces on this. And I'm not sure if I have it right even still. The government cost cutting, when I started to draw this, I thought, how much are they really going to be able to cut out of the cost of government? Well, a lot's dependent on lawsuits that are now coming and the way they've handled firing people from the federal government and so on. So I don't know where that's going to land, but maybe they'll cut a lot more cost out of it than I had ever figured. And of course, based on the language that was being used, I thought the deportations would be a bigger deal, and maybe it eventually will, but so far they're not there. Anyway, that's how we need to think about the tariffs. This is a slide, like literally, well, and actually, I guess I haven't updated this since last night's 6 o'clock news, but you have to update it daily, right? So you got all these on again, off again things. I guess I'll let you read the slide. I guess the one thing is that you have to watch third countries. And I know, because of the markets that you serve, you watch China very closely. Well, when we get into EU retaliation against the US, we want to watch that too, because that could open up opportunities for us, right? So for example, I think that's the very next slide. Again, this is another one you have to update daily. The blueprint is retaliation against the U.S. The red print is actions brought by the U.S. against Canada or China. The EU, a couple weeks ago, they said they were going to retaliate against the U.S. on soybeans. Now, this is a big deal because they imported last year, it was over 5 million ton of soybeans, okay? And if part of that gets thrown back into the U.S. market, they're building crush plants very aggressively in the U.S. So if that happens, that may have the effect of dampening some of their demand for canola oil, right? Which, as probably all of you know, is a very big deal. I have an illustration of it here momentarily. Or not. Okay, we're back. Yeah, so rather than trying to go through all of the various elements of this, we're 30 years into operating under a rules-based international trading system. We don't have the resources to and I hope everybody understands I'm simplifying things with this representation of it. It's more complicated than that. So for example, the EU is out of the Chinese market on pork and beef because they have African swine fever and foot and mouth disease, right? Well, that's a big deal. So in terms of understanding how all these trade flows end up rerouting associated with this, extremely complicated. But when you have a rules-based trading environment, you don't particularly have to worry about it, right? Well, now we have to worry about it, and to some of what Marlene was saying, I don't think we have the resources and the expertise to sort out this kind of world, because you start peeling this thing back and you discover it's like an onion. There's 4 or 5 different layers, and trying to keep all this straight in your own mind is very difficult. Can you move me to the next slide? Okay, so I've been looking for software that'll do this, and this is this seems to get at some of it. So who are we selling canola to? Well, I think we know we're selling canola to China. Can you let me see if it works here. This is canola oil. So you have a dominant buyer of canola oil that's different than the dominant buyer for the crop itself. Then when you get into meal, it's split up differently again. And this is before you even, there's a whole other dimension of this, which is companies, which is grain companies that trade the product. And when they're operating in different geographies, that's yet another complication to this. But it makes the situation, I think, not only urgent, but very difficult to sort out. This is complicated stuff. Canadian agriculture is, quite apart from what we've heard thus far, is going to be a major target for the U.S. Why? Because the U.S. has opened up a major trade deficit with Canada. So this is U.S. data. I tend to like the import data better than the export data because it's always more, you get more detail from the import data. So you can see that in a course of really a short number of years here, we'll go on this side this time, that those blue lines here, which are basically ready to eat type foods, we were, the U.S. was a net exporter to Canada, and look at what's happened. It's you might say, well, this is a great success story for Canadian agriculture and food. These red kind of hatched bars here, these are intermediate products, livestock, things like canola oil, canola meal, and in fact, if you want to look at what's changing here dramatically in that regard, I think these are imports by the U.S. from Canada of some combination of canola oil and used cooking oil used to make renewable diesel fuel. It's a dramatic it's a dramatic change. But ordinarily, you would think we worry about our competitiveness, how we compete with the U.S. This should be a matter of pride, but now it looks like a liability, right? Because when the president talks about matters like this, they'll say, well, we're subsidizing the Canadians to the degree of, whatever it is there. It's about 13 billion US. We're subsidizing the Canadians, or we're losing. Well, we need to correct for that. So, you've sort of inadvertently drawn a type of a target on your chest. What does this province export to the U.S.? And this is going to be small print, so I'll read it for you. This blue line here is canola oil, essentially. There's other things in it as well, but I checked. It's overwhelmingly canola oil. The orange bar here is cereals, durum, and other wheats primarily. You can hardly see it here, but this is oil seeds, which of course is canola. The U.S. doesn't buy a lot of canola from Saskatchewan or from elsewhere in Canada for that matter. There's a red line here. This is products of the milling industry. If you go and look at it, it's primarily rolled oats, flaked oats, those kinds of products. And this blue hatched line here is livestock, and I was surprised to the degree to which bees. It's not a lot of slaughter cattle, not a lot of hogs in it, bulls and bees. But the takeaway from this is, what do you sell in the U.S.? You're selling them canola oil, canola meal, and I think we probably knew that. Now, if you look at China, the picture's very different, and really you could ignore almost everything else except for cereals, which is again durum, other wheats. I believe there's some barley as well, probably malt, and then, oops, not sure. Can I get that turned back? I screwed that up. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. It's canola. It's the crop, right? It's the crop. So when you add all this up, if you're thinking about, China has tariffs out against Canada, including the threat of a dumping case that is not yet, we don't know the outcome. Well, sorry, we do know the outcome of it. There's going to be, if they're inclined to, there's going to be a dumping duty. We know how they treated Australia on barley. They're going to treat us the same way on canola. They're just biding their time, would be my sense of it. But we also have the action on canola oil and meal, which of course they don't buy much of. As you can see, what they're buying is the crop essentially. So what is, if you're comparing China with the U.S. in this province, what's your greater liability? And it may come as a surprise to you, but if you add it up, it's clearly the U.S. It's running about $500 million a month value of trade, Saskatchewan to the U.S., and you can see in China, it's a narrower group of products and it's more erratic, but it's generally lower. So, I mean, both are a problem, don't get me wrong, but you have a little bit more liability to the U.S. than to China. This is the Canadian exports of manufactured foods. We don't have to get into any great detail on this. The blue bar here is baked goods, cereal, and pasta. And look at how that has grown. It's $6 billion US a year. And the companies have invested in it. You don't get that kind of move just from an increase in the price, right? There's more and more food manufacturing that is going to the U.S. There's a few other things I'll make reference to here. Beef, we know the cow herd's in decline, so that's probably largely a price effect. But look, without getting into the detail of it, you can see the trend on this. Our sales are going up, so companies have invested in this, and now they're vulnerable to it. This is some information I got from the the survey of manufacturers, and a couple of years ago, they started asking companies to what degree their shipments were destined for the U.S. And, you can more or less ignore a lot of this other than, so if you look on your baking side, which is what we were talking about a minute ago, in 2020, 24% of the value of their shipments were destined for the U.S. Now, most recently, in 2022, 31%, so it's going up. Same thing with your grain and oilseed milling. It's gone from 22% to 27%. But you have to keep in mind, like some of the companies in a survey like this don't have any exports to the U.S. So these are averages, right? So there's going to be some companies that have like 80%, hopefully not too many, of their value of shipments going to the U.S. So the reason I share this is, as farmers, you tend to think about your direct exports of, the animal, the crop, et cetera. But actually, a lot of this, I think, comes down to not your customer, but it's your customer's customer who's on the front line of this. So it's the food processing company that has some of their sales badly impaired, and then everything runs back to the farm, right? So you start to notice your basis will start to widen, and why is this happening? Well, maybe it's your customer's customer got badly bruised up by these tariffs. It's also, I think, important to understand what we import from the U.S., particularly when we think about retaliation. And these are just what happened to come in over $1 billion in 2023. So you got vehicles and equipment, including farm equipment, parts for vehicles and equipment, including farm equipment, and then fuels for vehicles and equipment. Those are, I had to group these, but that's one way to group it. Medicines, including animal health products, ethanol, food preparations and bakery ware. So remember, that was the biggest and fastest growing category of our exports to the U.S. We also import a lot of it, and I want you to remember that when you're thinking about where you retaliate, because you can, if you've got something where you have two-way trade, you can retaliate on that and just say, well, we can just do import replacement, right? Pet food, one that I hope everybody understands. When you get into MAP, DAP, triple superphosphate, we don't have any of it, none. It comes from Florida, basically, or it comes from West Africa. If it's coming from West Africa, some of you know we've had bad experience with that with contaminants in phosphate fertilizers. So the phosphate fertilizer we want comes from the U.S. So that we do not want to retaliate on phosphate fertilizers. That would be a real big problem for us. Also, pesticides, seed to some degree, not all seeds, but some seeds. And it turns out, for whatever reason, combines are listed differently than other equipment. Is. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, how is this going to work? Now, remember, we're 30 years from having this experience, okay? So the short answer is, I think we're going to learn on the go how this is going to work. But formally, a tariff is a tax that's payable at the border, and it's payable by the importer. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the cost of that sticks with the importer. Depending on factors, this could be passed back to the seller, or it could be carried through to the ultimate customer. In my understanding of it, the way this is going to work is you have a product that arrives at the border. You've got a bill of lading that has the value of the shipment. If it's not in U.S. dollars, they'll convert it to U.S. dollars. They'll take the applicable tariff, and that is payable by U.S. Customs by the importer. Now, they could turn around and say, okay, well, I guess we just have to charge our customer that much more for the product. Or they could turn around and say, I'm not going to pay that. The seller's going to pay that. This will vary according to any number of factors that I'm going to go over here in a moment. And I'm not going to take you back to school on this, okay? But if you've got a product that is a commodity product that the U.S. has plenty of, I think wheat might be a good example of this. I'm not sure why they would pay the tariff. They can't pass that on. They got all kinds of wheat. A possible counterexample would be oats, right? The U.S. imports a lot of oats from Canada. Can they, look, if you can grow corn, you can grow oats, but as a matter of practice, they don't, and they don't grow oats, and it would take some time for them to learn how to do it well. So, if you're shipping oats, I think you probably got a better shot that some of that will be passed on to the seller. But more generally, if you've got a niche, if you've got a brand, if you've got something that just really doesn't face much competition in the U.S., you got a better chance that this will be pushed through and not thrust back on you. Now, again, I promised I wasn't going to take you back to school, so I'm not going to do that. But what to take away from this is when you're an open economy, okay, the pricing occurs in the international market. And when you're an exporter, if that's working properly, you can sell more at a higher price. And this is why free trade is very important. Now, if you're in a situation in which the customer country, has capacity that, they can produce some of this themselves, it's not, what you're selling them isn't particularly special. When you turn around and put a tariff on, they're able to push it right back on you because they got plenty of their own, or they can develop it easily, okay? Now, conversely, if you have a brand, if you have a niche, if you got something that's difficult, that's highly in demand, that they can't find somebody else to substitute for yours, you've got, in theory, the same tariff, but actually it doesn't have much effect on you. Doesn't lower your price too much, doesn't reduce how much you can sell all that much because that's essentially passed on to the customer. So now we've got the job of going through and, of trying to figure out of our products, this comes down to, basically your price elasticity, right? So if the price goes up by a particular amount, how much less is demanded by the customer? Well, you've got a myriad of products that I have an illustration of this here in a moment that people are going to go through. The other thing to keep in mind is, you have to go further afield than the farm product that you sell, okay? It's your customer's customer. So if you get up to the food processor here, and like on cookies and crackers, okay? We've grown a great export business in cookies and crackers and those kinds of products. But if you're up here at that level and the tariff comes on and the tariff pushes back that demand, it all flows back to the farm, right? That's where it's all going. The processor is going to say, well, look, I got a manufacturing cost here apart from what I'm paying the farmers for the farm product, and I got no relief for that. So it just decreases the demand and decreases the price for the farm product. So there's two aspects to this. And, I saw this article day before yesterday. It was in Reuters. And this is the department stores and the supermarkets, okay? But you can see this is what they're going through right now. So they're talking to their suppliers. They're saying, okay, well, look, you're going to pay the tariff. No, you're going to pay the tariff. Well, how much sales are you going to lose if you increase the price a bit? Well, I don't, and this is basically what this article is telling us is this is the conversation that's going on right now. So, and the worry about this is it works its way back through the system, and I think we're going to have other discussions around supply chains and that sort of thing. And this, I think you're going to see this. It works right back through the system, so it's quite pervasive. Now, somebody's going to say, yeah, but wait a minute, we have a trade agreement with the U.S. And the U.S. is a member of the WTO. We're supposed to be protected against this, right? Not really. If you go and look at the language of the CUSMA agreement, it has pretty open, there's a clause in there that says something to the effect of there's nothing in this agreement that will prohibit a member country from addressing an emergency. So if that sounds like a blank check, it reads I'm not a lawyer, but it looks like a blank check, all right? You know, I glanced over this first point here, which actually could end up being quite important because I guess we're getting the evidence day by day as there's any number of lawsuits that the new administration is encountering and whether they're going to abide by judges' rulings. But there's the 25% tariff on Canadian product as a whole. There is an argument that I understand from sort of the legal scholars, which is that the legislation in the U.S. that's based on is what is used for sanctions. So, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were sanctions that came on. Well, they used that legislation to justify the sanctions. In other words, we just don't buy whatever the product is. There's an argument that can't be used for tariffs. It's never been used for tariffs before, in fact. So there may be a lawsuit that comes in that says, well, wait a minute, the president can't do that. It requires an act of Congress, which takes quite a lot more time, right? If not, even if the outcome is preordained, it takes quite a lot more time. So you may begin to see lawsuits like that, similar to the lawsuits that have come on the method that you use to fire people from the federal government in the U.S. So there may be some hope that'll sort of, if nothing else, blunt the sharp end for us in terms of what's going on there. When you look at WTO, so our trade agreement with the U.S. Maybe is not particularly helpful. What about the WTO? Well, the original GATT agreement, they had to contemplate international trade when countries went to war with one another and that sort of thing. It's a little bit more prescriptive, but I don't think it's going to be limiting because hopefully everybody understands that at this point with the appeals process totally sidelined at the WTO, you could take a WTO case against them. By the way, you'll read that Canada we've entered into what's called conciliation with the U.S. at WTO. That's not going to solve the problem. We're there doing that to get on record exactly what has happened for future considerations. But I don't think anybody's under the illusion that this is going to solve anything. So if a country at WTO, you take a WTO case against them, they don't like the outcome, they'll appeal it. But there's no panel to appeal it to because it's been sidelined. So they'll just keep doing what they were doing. So that doesn't provide us any relief. So, and this is what takes us to the law of the jungle. So this is why we do things like retaliate aggressively. And I hope people understand that we really do need to retaliate. I've read things that say, well, look, there's no U.S. state that has more than about 8% of its GDP from exports to Canada. So what do you think you're trying to do with retaliation? That's sort of a mass balance view of it, but that's not the way to look at it. This occurs at the margin. So what you do is you go to, so one of the things we're going to retaliate on apparently is orange juice. So, you go to Florida and there's going to be some company or some subset of companies in Florida that have the Canadian account for orange juice. And if you hit them hard, they will scream. And they'll go to the president and say, well, this many people are going to get thrown out of work, this much loss, this the land values, all the different things. So that's why you need to do that. You need to make a narrow set of people hurt real bad, and they'll convince themselves that what they're doing to us is a bad idea. But that comes with the law of the jungle. Okay, what is it that we can do about this? The first thing is we need to come to grips with, this is not an aberration. This is not something that we're going to tolerate, live through, and in some number of years' time, it'll go back to normal. I don't think that's this. And if, I guess more importantly, if that were the case, I'd be happy to be surprised. But if you take that view into it, you're going to under-respond, okay? So history is done. We're somewhere else. What can you do? The first thing is, if you've got U.S. customers, talk to them. work with them, talk about how you can do things differently, because the two of you are going to have to live with how to navigate these tariffs. Just talked about retaliation. We need to do it. The best things to retaliate on are the things that we export to them, because we can just turn around and replace the imports. It's probably not going to be perfect, but it's an option for us. When I mentioned a while ago, watch the third countries. Okay, so for example, if the EU retaliates against the US with tariffs, that could open up an opportunity for us. So some of the things that we have been selling to the US, maybe we could sell to the EU, or they've started to go after Japan now, or they're talking about it anyway. They don't like Japanese import barriers around rice. Well, my experience, you don't mess with the Japanese on rice. They take that very personally. Rice is important culturally to them and so on. So if they offend the Japanese and the Japanese retaliate on them, well, maybe we can go and replace some of the things that the Japanese used to buy from the Americans. But it's complicated and it's hard work, and it's not going to be easy when some of these could be new markets for us. Anticipate the hurt with programming. So we've had some announcements very recently about changes to agri-stability and the BRM suite in general, and we're going to need to do that. The thing to keep in mind is, as farmers, your customers don't have programs like that. They have not wanted programs like that, but now there may be no choice, right? Because look, the idea that you're not going to have a thinning out, that nobody's going to go out of business over this is naive. There's going to be food industry bankruptcies that will result from this. I think you can just about count on it. So what are we doing to help them? And as farm groups, that's another thing. You can bring your influence to try and help them. I first heard our former lead trade negotiator, Steve Rahul, talk about industrial strategies 2 or 3 years ago. And it made me shudder, because look, for my career, industrial strategy has been a terrible idea. I mean, we have all the experience of, some of you remember from the 1970s and 80s, the British disease, and there was something else called the Dutch disease, which was around propping up these hopelessly inefficient companies and terrible waste of public funds and everything. And we learned that, no, it's free trade. That's where we're on. We don't want to get into that. We may not have a choice. We may be driven to that. And we need to learn how to do this well. In any event, thank you. And if there's time for questions or comments, be happy to take them. And I'll be around all day too if you want to talk to me.
If there are any questions, just make your way to the mic.
Thanks for that, but I just very briefly wanted to circle back to the contracts between farmers, and I understand the difficulties that will come back through the system, and I think the farmers understand that too. But I wanted to say that the farmer has a contract with the grain companies, and that stands on its own. The contracts that the grain company has with their customer is their risk. The farmer actually doesn't have the third-party risk that the grain company has, and they're not responsible for that. So while I'm sure that a lot of the farmers will want to help them out if there is a problem, the starting point in the negotiation is that you have a valid contract. And I just wanted to emphasize that, because when it goes the other way around, like in 2021, that's the standpoint the farmers have taken as well.
Yeah, thanks. No, very good point.
Bateman, Gravelberg, RM 104. The Canadian economy and crush plants has just been the best thing that's ever happened in Western Canada. And of course, Cargill's plant here in Saskatoon is one of the biggest in the world and most profitable in the world. Why hasn't the US developed some crush plants? There's a couple in the US, but they're very small, that have been operating for 10 years. But why haven't they developed some of their own crush industry for canola? We know they're very good at crushing soybeans, but are they now, as you say, building plants? How many and how large are these plants?
So I'd have to remember where I saw this, but there's a map you can get that maps out crush plants throughout the United States that are in operation and others that are under construction, and there's a capacity number that goes with them. That's maybe the best way I can answer your question. You know what? Later on through the day, let me see if I can find that. Because it's important, right? This is an important issue. Why are they not crushing canola in some of these plants? In my understanding of it, at least some crush plants, I mean, we have 2 of them in Ontario that are capable of crushing canola and have crushed canola.
Yep, I know that.
Why don't they, I don't know, other than, you know, the mindset in the US is it's a corn soybean economy. And that's kind of what drives everything.
That's worked damn well for us. But
Marlene wants to quickly
the
weigh in.
new reality is
Can I
Trump
just briefly add
Yeah.
wants to bring industry home.
Yeah, Jim, I think Marlene has
ahead.
something to add.
Just to briefly add to that, they all have hard seed crush plants, and canola is a soft seed crush plant. As you just said, there are just a few that are switch plants where you can do both, and they simply don't have enough acreage on the soft seeds yet to build soft seed plants. So that's why they import the canola.
Yeah, that's maybe the bigger issue is for the most part, US farmers haven't had the incentive to grow canola. If you can grow soybeans, you grow soybeans instead.
2 questions, Al. One is, this isn't the first time we've dealt with tariff situations historically, and just a bit of a history lesson, how have those been resolved? Second part of the question is that in our business risk management programs, we have always been cognizant of things we can and cannot do because of retaliation from the United States. Now, are these bets off now in terms of our business risk management programs?
Yeah, that's a great, I'm glad you raised that point. Let me deal with on tariffs. It's not the first time we've dealt with tariffs, you're right. Probably the best example that we have are the embargoes that the US put on very short notice without particularly consulting allies in the early 70s to deal with the what we call the Russian grain robbery. And then again in 1980, dealing with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at the time. Yeah, I've started to pull out some of that old material just to kind of review how this worked, and fascinating history lesson. The way they had, at the time they brought the embargo in against the Soviets in 1980, they had 17 million ton of wheat and corn sold forward by grain companies, and they had to bring the Commodity Credit Corporation in to assume all the contracts because there were massive losses against the value of these contracts, right? So it's a fascinating story. So far, I don't know how much help it is really in terms of thinking through this. And then you have to go further back in the past really to get into sort of ongoing tariffs. Now, the other point you raised was, what about our BRM programs? And there's 2 elements to this. The BRM programs that we have in place are very specially designed to anticipate the prospect of countervail and attack by other countries. And it maps back essentially to 1984 and the case that was brought against hogs from the old tripartite programs that we had in place. And we learned that you've got to structure these things so that they will be robust to those kinds of attacks. So that's why we have what we have. Conversely, the programs are designed to withstand variability in ag markets consistent with other people obeying their obligations in terms of trade. Well, particularly that latter point is from what I can tell, all but out the window now. And it's not just the US. I mean, we have big problems with the US, but there's plenty of other countries that, particularly around export bans and export limitations across a wide range of staple farm and food products, that put volatility into the system that our programs didn't really contemplate in terms of their design. So if that sounds like, back to the old drawing board on BRM programming, that's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but we're gonna have to take a hard look at it. And I was pleased to see some of the changes announced for agri-stability. So he raised the cap. The payment rate, I guess my opinion based on the work that I do is would be much better if we had a more sensitive trigger than increasing the payment rate. Because what you've got now is the payment rate works pretty well for, and the existing trigger works pretty well for livestock. It doesn't work that well for grains, and it doesn't work, it doesn't work very well for cow-calf either. If you could raise the trigger up to an 85% trigger like we had back when it was called the CASE program, that would do a world of good, I think, for the grains and oil seeds as well as the cow-calf sector.
One last quick question.
Great presentation, Al. I liked a lot of it.
I'm glad you did. I didn't like any of it. It's all bad news.
Oh, no, it's never bad news. It's never bad news. You're on the right side of the soil. I had a recent talk to a mixed farmer from Ohio, and his indication was that his proposed tariffs would hurt our farmers and your farmers. But we have limited choices. The U.S. is on the verge of bankruptcy. Our country's total accumulated debt is $38 trillion. Our interest on that debt is $1 trillion. That $1 trillion debt will eventually be more than what we spend on the U.S. military.
That's right.
We have to do, this is his case, Ron's case, we have to do something. Tariffs is one of the things that might work, but it's a last resort. And I think we're going into a health break. Next, I'll give you a point of interest. In my book of useless information, how much is a trillion?
It's 1,000 billion.
If you take, yeah, that's right. If you took $1,000 bills, laid them flat, one on top of another, it would be 62 miles high. Thank you.
Yeah. No, can I just sort of respond to that? Your friend's right, okay. And I've come around to, when we're looking for historical precedents for somebody like Donald Trump, a lot of the discussions have gone back to President Andrew Jackson, who was a 19th century president, and of course, none of us have any memory of him. I think the better analogy actually is Nixon. And I mean, Trump has gone far beyond Nixon, of course, but from the standpoint of being prepared to take on some of these untouchable issues, as you mentioned, the U.S. debt, which is stunningly large, he's prepared to take that on like some of his predecessors have not been. And I think, to be fair, we would say that that's to his credit. Now, keep in mind, part of the reason for that is the major income tax cut that he put in the first Trump administration, which expires this year. And then he wants to not only make that permanent, he wants to reduce it even further. That very materially influences this massive debt. But they need to find a way to deal with it, because you're right. I don't think the United States is going to go bankrupt, but that's the direction. Yep.